So, we're here to talk about the economic impacts of the Clean Power Plan. And if someone asks me what are the economic impacts of the Clean Power Plan, I'm going to tell you straight up, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is I don't know what the states are going to do, because they have lots of policy choices. And also, I'm a national modeler. I do models of federal policies. And so there's going to be a lot of interactions that are going to be really hard to pinpoint. So instead of telling you what the impacts are going to be, I'm going to take some lessons from what I know and hopefully be able to tell you something about what to expect from the Clean Power Plan. So we went over this very heavily yesterday, but just as a brief reminder, what is the Clean Power Plan? It's an effort to reduce carbon emissions from the electric power sector. There's a lot, and it's the largest source of carbon emissions in the U.S. Another thing we didn't really talk about yesterday is this is actually a major part of the U.S.'s what's called the intended nationally determined contribution to the UN's climate negotiations. So President Obama presented this as one of the key ways we're going to reduce emissions to fulfill our pledge to the Paris negotiations coming up in November. And it's an interesting policy because it's a collection of state targets set by the EPA. There are 4 building blocks. They call the best system emissions reductions. And then to make it even more confusing, the policy can be rate-based or the states can actually convert it to a mass-based standard. And the plan is going to be implemented by the states, and that means each state is free to choose its own policy. So what are we going to do with that? So just a very basic environmental economics, there's 3 channels for reducing emissions. We can reduce emissions per unit of output, we can reduce output, or we can do end-of-pipe treatment. So end-of-pipe treatment is if you think of sulfur dioxide, we can put scrubbers in the towers and we can get rid of the pollution that way. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be an option for carbon emissions unless we can somehow come up with a cost-affordable carbon capture and sequestration, which I don't see in the near future. So let me talk about these 2 channels for reducing carbon emissions specifically in the electric power sector. First, we can reduce emissions per unit output. So examples of this are going to be increased efficiency within generator types. This is like building block 1. Let's make coal-fired plants more efficient. We can switch between generation types. This could be like building blocks 2 and 3. We can switch from coal to gas, or we can switch from gas to nuclear, or solar, or wind, or whatever. And so I'm going to call this input substitution for the remainder of my talk. We can also reduce output. I mean, the easiest way to do that is consume less electricity. Let's turn the lights off. Or let's turn up our thermostat and have a higher temperature in here instead of enjoying the nice, cool air conditioning. But we also have energy efficiency. We talked about a lot of that yesterday. But to me, energy efficiency is really the idea of we still get to consume the exact same thing. We still get lights in our building. We still get the air conditioning. But we're just going to get less. We're going to use less electricity to get that service. And so those are and that's building block 4 of the Clean Power Plan. So what can states do? One thing states could do is they could just pick from this list and just say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit from this, a little bit from that, a little bit from here. But I'm an economist, and I like market-based mechanisms. And what market-based mechanisms are going to do is they're going to give incentives for the market to choose the least cost option of deciding where to reduce emissions from these different choices. So as I said, as an economist, I'm really interested in comprehensive incentive-based policies, and so the remainder of my talk is going to be talking about these different types of policy options that I think that the states have. The first one is emissions pricing. We also talk, you could say, this mass-based policy. So an example is a carbon tax or cap and trade. This policy is going to potentially optionally reduce emissions through both input substitution and output reduction, and I'm including energy efficiency in output reduction, because it's going to give incentive to do both. The way it gives that incentive, it has a very strong price signal. So that price signal is going to be very good at giving the signal to either change the input substitution or to reduce output. I want to talk about one thing very briefly because it's going to highlight something in a few slides. Strong price signals are good for reducing emissions, but they may not be good for welfare because higher prices interact with other things in our economy like taxes, and this can have a high cost. So I don't want to go into detail, too much of the wonkish economic detail, what the tax interaction effect is, but it's a potential downside to a strong price signal. And a positive thing to emissions pricing is it creates allowance value. It creates a lot of money. And the key decision of any policy to be a carbon tax or cap and trade is what do you do with the money? And I'm going to show you that very clearly. The key policy choice is what do you do with that money? Now, another example of a comprehensive incentive-based policies are intensity standards. So two examples of this are a rate-based tradable performance standard or a clean energy standard. And I'll explain those in a little bit more detail. Now, these are potentially not as good as emissions pricing at reducing emissions because they only focus on input substitution. The only way that the clean energy standard works is to just give an incentive to switch between coal to renewable sources. And it doesn't do anything to give a signal to invest in energy efficiency or to turn your lights off more often. And so there's a weak price signal associated with this, but this might be a positive thing if it has a small tax interaction effect. So the key thing I want to take anyone here to take away is that different policy options have very different economic impacts. So the way I'm going to show this is instead of a new study trying to look at the Clean Power Plan specifically, I'm going to talk about two studies that I've worked on. One is called General Equilibrium Impacts of a Federal Clean Energy Standard. That's with Larry Goulder of Stanford and Rob Williams of University of Maryland. And then I also have a paper, a new paper forthcoming on unemployment and environmental regulation. So very briefly, what is the Clean Energy Standard in this paper and what we look at? It's a policy that requires minimum percentage of generation from clean sources. I have the apostrophes there because it's natural gas in the policies that are often proposed actually receives half a credit. So it's the definition of clean can be squishy. Some of these policies include hydronuclear in them, some of them don't. So we compare that policy to emissions equivalent power sector cap and trade program. We're going to use two different types of models. In particular, we're going to use a CG model I worked on for a number of years called the Goulder-Hafstead E3 model. So the key question we're asking is, can the relative advantage of CES with regard to the tax interaction effect outweigh the other margins, i.e. the weak price signal? So what are our key findings? Our first key finding is that cap and trade leads to higher electricity price increases, but also larger electricity demand reductions. So this is the percent change in the price of electricity over time from a standard that's very similar to a proposal by former Senator Bingaman, 80% standard by 2035 where natural gas receives a half credit. So you'll see that the clean energy standard in blue raises the price much less than the price of the equivalent cap and trade. And these emissions are equalized every period. So we're getting the same emissions reductions, we're just getting them different ways. And so if you look at demand, it's the opposite. So the demand, percent change in demand is a lot lower under the clean energy standard because the strong price signal is not giving the incentive to reduce output and increase energy efficiency. The second set of key findings is that the relative cost between these types of policies are going to depend on policy stringency, whether or not you give any credit for natural gas generators, and how allowances are allocated in the cap and trade. So this is a slide showing for 4 different types of a clean energy standard and its equivalent cap and trade. What are the relative costs, or what are the costs? And so first thing I actually want you to pay attention to is that in the very high stringency, the welfare cost per ton is $16. So this is right into that $10 to $30 that Billy talked about. So these are not incredibly expensive policies. And including even the very low one, the policy is very, very cheap, but also delivers very, very little emissions reductions. So in some cases, the cap and trade is better. Towards the high stringency, cap and trade is better. Toward the low stringency, we actually found that the clean energy standard could do slightly better, the lower cost. Now this is going to depend crucially on what we do to the natural gas credit. So in blue here, for different levels of stringency, I have the ratio of the costs for when you don't give natural gas any credit. And that number is always greater than 1, no matter what. Clean energy standard is always less cost effective than carbon or cap and trade if you completely ignore natural gas from the policy. On the flip side, if you give natural gas a complete credit, if you over-subsidize it, we actually find that that actually reduces the cost even relative to the baseline policy of the 50% credit. Finally, we find that the relative costs really depend on allowance allocation. The right bar in the set of 5 bars in each case refers to cap and trade free allocation. Let's just give all the allowances to the polluters for free and then let them trade. That's always the most expensive policy. The least expensive policy in every case is cap and trade, where we take the money and cut corporate taxes. So that's our most efficient policy, and so the clean energy standard is going to be somewhere in between, depending on what the money is used for from the cap and trade. So that's the first paper I want to talk about. The second paper is, I have 5 minutes to finish up here, is employment impacts in a new model. It's because politicians and policymakers care about jobs. In Washington, D.C., we get this question all the time: what is the job impacts? When the Clean Power Plan was first proposed, Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming said, the administration is set up to kill coal and it's 800,000 jobs. Now, you might want to point out that there was less than 90,000 jobs in coal production in 2012, but you could also argue that there's downstream effects. So the true number is probably somewhere between 90,000 and 800,000. Probably closer to 90. Gina McCarthy, on the other hand, is a really strong proponent of the Clean Power Plan generating green jobs. And so there's a quote here from that we're going to secure good-paying jobs here at home. So we have a very simple model right now, and so I don't want you to take too much insight from it, or too much from it, but I do think it has some good insights. It's a model that has a new model that has unemployment and has labor market dynamics that other models don't do, and it allows for abatement opportunities where you can have these green jobs where you can hire workers to help reduce your emissions per unit of output. So we consider 3 types of policies. We consider a $20 a ton carbon tax with lump sum rebates. Let's give everyone a check. We do another one where we consider the same policy, only we take the money and we use it to finance a reduction in payroll taxes. And then a performance standard that has the same emissions reductions. So the key results is that net unemployment changes very little, 0 to 0.3 percentage points, depending on the policy. And the reason that the net unemployment change is very small is because job losses in the polluting sector are offset by gains in the other sector. But I have to have a caveat here, is that the spillover effects vary by the policy. And I'll show that in a second. So here's just the total first result, is the unemployment rate over time. The carbon tax with lump sum rebates does the worst, but by worst it's only raising unemployment from 7% to 7.25%. So that's very small when you consider in the Great Recession we had unemployment go from 5% to almost 10%. So compared to like a big economic downturn, this is not very large. And you can see that the other 2 policies have almost no impact on net unemployment. And the reason, before I go too far, that was for one type of policy. You can also look at this, comparing the unemployment rate by how much reductions you actually want to get. So percent reductions. And so again, the carbon tax with lump sum rebates is always going to have the biggest effect on unemployment, and the carbon tax with the payroll tax reductions is always going to have the lowest impact on unemployment. And performance standards do pretty well, although as you get more and more emissions reductions, that tends not to be true. So how this happens is this just kind of 3 graphs. Lump sum rebates, you see what happens to the clean sector and the dirty sector. Dirty sector gets smaller, clean sector gets bigger. I really want to focus on is, as I change the slides, you can see exactly what's going to happen. Is that if I go from lump sum to payroll taxes, the blue line goes up. And so the reason we're getting a less net unemployment impact in that policy is because we're reducing the payroll taxes in the clean industry as well as the dirty industry, and that's giving them an incentive to hire more workers. Now, looking at a performance standard, you can see that there's almost no job impact in either industry. So there's very small job losses, but there's also very small job gains. So what do I think are the lessons for the Clean Power Plan? Kind of a summary. As I said earlier, policy details matter. So emissions and pricing, the biggest policy detail is what do you do with the money? For intensity standards, are you incentivizing a switch from coal to natural gas? Because a carbon tax or a cap and trade will make that incentive. And so a policy that, intensity standard that doesn't also incentivize that is probably going to be more costly. So, I mean, what policy should the states choose? Well, I think that depends on what metric you actually care about. How are you going to evaluate these options? Do you evaluate it on economic efficiency? Do you evaluate it on aggregate unemployment? Or do you evaluate it on job loss? Do you care about job loss instead of net effects? Or do you care about only electricity prices? And so Each of the policies I showed you are going to have different effects on these, and the ranking is not always going to be the same depending on what metric. So thank you.